Well, welcome everybody to this edition of the Next Gen webinar. We're excited to talk about Generation Z today with Reverend Melissa Cooper. Melissa currently serves as the Minister of Worship and Arts at St. Luke's United Methodist Church in Orlando, Florida. And she also serves as an associate where she does some coaching and consulting with Vibrant Faith. She's an expert in intergenerational culture building and is passionate about developing leaders for intergenerational faith communities. She is married to Will, and they are parents of the cutest poodle that you'll ever meet. And so we're excited to have Melissa with us today. And we're also excited that we've just launched our podcast as well on iTunes. And so maybe you don't have the opportunity to watch the video, but you can now go to iTunes and look for Next Gen TNUMC podcast and subscribe to that feed, and you'll be able to listen to this audio plus the audio of the other previous recorded webinars that we've had. So the way this works is that we're going to let Melissa share her knowledge with us, and if we have questions, we'll ask those when it's appropriate. And then if you might have questions later after you listen to this, you'll be able to contact Melissa through her contact that she'll provide at the end, or through her website there that you can see, reverendmelissacooper.com. Well, thank you, Melissa, for joining us today.
Thanks. So glad to be here. So today I wanted to look a little bit about Generation Z. There isn't a guaranteed, decided upon name for this generation yet, and so we're still using that placeholder of Gen Z. But what I want to emphasize is something that so often we don't get to see, which is a generational view of our young people. A lot of times we just take them based on sort of what we see of them right now, sort of a point in time, a survey-based look at this generation or any generation. But what a generational view allows us to do is to actually look at a generation, a group of people, an age group in the scope of a more historical perspective, and not just what they are doing at this time and in this moment. I always joke that every teenager in every generation had a right to kind of be an idiot. Like, that's kind of what teenagers do. They get to make bad choices and do stupid things, and that's part of being a teenager, is doing that. Brains are still forming. And that has been the case for every group of teenagers throughout history. And so when we look at our teens and we ask the question, like, why are they doing these dumb things? Oh my goodness, what's going to happen to this generation? It's really, really a dangerous way to look at things, because we're not thinking about what we did when we were teenagers. We're not remembering, and we don't have that data. We don't know. We weren't there. We didn't have the same perspective when different generations were at the same age. Those of us who work with young people also know that those darn kids is not the only way to look at our young people, that they're actually extremely intelligent, they're extremely capable, and they're extremely valuable to our churches and to our ministries. And so we're able to take sort of a 20,000-foot view of literally looking generationally at Generation Z, rather than just saying, what are they doing right now, and making calls about what they need based on that. So that's kind of my approach today, is to not just look at what they like and what they don't like and what they're doing now, but how does that relate to previous generations at the same age, in the same time frame. And that kind of gives us an idea of where they are at this point in relation to other generations. That's what can give us the idea of what do we need for this generation at this time, rather than just responding sort of knee-jerk reaction like in the given moment. So we are actually going to play a little game. And it's a little game, it's a challenge for you. And if all of you, say that you might work with Gen Zers, and we define Gen Z as those born 1997-ish until 2015-ish. We're not sure, we haven't put those markers for sure on there, but that's the estimate at this point. So I'll invite everybody, if you want to unmute, or we can do kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle. So all of these questions are going to be about Gen Z in relation to previous generations. So millennials, Gen X, baby boomers, and on. And we'll talk a little bit more about those generations coming up. But the questions are all going to be present an activity, and then you decide, does Gen Z do this more than previous generations, less than previous generations, or about the same as previous generations? All right. We ready?
Yep.
All right.
I just want you to know I'm planning to win. So
That's good. That's good. All right. So first one, driving.
Less.
Nancy says less. Brad says less. All right. Everybody says less. Driving, less. Absolutely. They are less often driving themselves. They're far more often being driven by parents. Drinking, more, less, or about the same?
I'd say less.
Got a lot of less. Kylie's not sure.
About the same. I think about
Less drinking than previous generations at the same age. Teen pregnancy, more, less, or about the same?
Less.
Less. We see less teen pregnancy in this generation.
They better be, because I've got 2 of them.
Work for pay, more, less, or about the same? So some sort of a job that would give them some sort of wages.
I'd say more. More.
Got more. Julie's not so sure. They're actually doing less paid work than previous generations, pretty significantly. Both summer jobs and year-round work have dropped from previous generations. On the other side, volunteering, more, less, or about the same?
More.
Less. All right, we've got conflicting answers here. It's actually about the same. It's about the same. What we actually see is that the rise in volunteering actually already happened with the millennials, and Gen Z has kind of continued on that trajectory.
Do you think that on that question, the institution of community service hours for high school education became a bigger part of that? Didn't that?
I think so. I think it's interestingly enough, I think there's more of that required with Gen Z than there was with previous generations, but we don't necessarily see a huge uptick yet at this point with their generation doing even more than millennials. So that must have been more of a millennial starter. But I think that's definitely a lot of it. What about extracurriculars, sports, dance, theater?
I'd say about the same.
It's about the same as previous generations. They spend about the same amount of time doing extracurriculars. Dating. Nancy says very clearly less. Kylie says more. All right. Less dating, significantly less dating than previous generations. They're more likely to go somewhere either with their parents in tow or with groups if they're going anywhere. But they're also just generally going out less, spending a lot more time at home in general. How about allowance? Do you think Gen Z gets more allowance, less allowance, or about the same allowance as previous generations?
more.
Oh, we've got a conflicting group here. So here, I found this one to be extremely interesting.
What?
They get quite a bit less allowance. Now, allowance is not the same thing as their parents paying for things. So what we see is that that Gen Z is getting less money to determine what happens to it themselves. More of Gen Z is just asking for parents for what they want or need. And so very seldom are they given a set amount of money every month to budget and do with what they want. It's just when they want or need something, they ask their parents for it.
Well, my kids are getting a pay cut then.
Well, we'll see if you still feel that way after we get through the whole whole thing. What about homework? More homework, less homework, or about the same as previous generations?
I'd say more.
I would have said the same thing. What we find is they spend a slightly less amount of time on homework than previous generations do. So maybe not volume wise of homework, but the time they spend on it is, I'm talking like 10, 15 minutes a week less based on the research, but it is not significantly more, which is what I would have expected.
Mm-hmm.
Drugs, doing more drugs, less drugs, or about the same drugs. And we're talking like illegal drugs, just to be clear.
About the same.
All of the above. So it depends on which generation you compare them to. The height of drug use was in the 70s, and so you see them. You see less, a little bit less than your younger baby boomers, older Gen Xers. It dropped significantly in the 90s, and then has gone back up just slightly for Gen Z. So really, it just depends on who you compare them to.
So more than the millennials?
More than millennials. Mm-hmm. Okay. Or maybe it's about this. I think it's about the same as millennials. Oh, I don't have that data in front of me right now, okay. But it was different for each of the generations, and it depended on where you compared to. Okay. Fighting with their parents. Do they fight with their parents more, less, or about the same as previous generations?
I'd say less.
Okay, less. They are fighting with their parents less. Because when your parents hold all the money and you don't get it for yourself, you need to keep that relationship intact, right?
That's right.
So less fighting with parents than previous generations. They actually have a pretty decent relationship with their parents overall, at least on the surface. This is the last one. When asked if they like the age that they currently are, did Gen Z say they liked it more often, less often, or about the same as previous generations did?
I don't know.
They like being their age more than previous generations liked being their age. So young teen, tweens and teens now like being tweens and teens. They are much happier by 10 or 15%. I think said they liked their age more than previous generations did. So. What does that tell you? What are the things that come to mind when you hear that?
Well, I can I think about my two children. I've got a 15 and a 17-year-old, and we don't see them as much either. Like, I wonder if that would be a question. How often are you spending in family time? You know, because there's so many things that pull for their time. You know, I also think that I think I was more dependent on my parents than my kids seem to be on us a little bit. Even though my kids, Collins, the younger one, is ready to drive now, and Mary, the older one, doesn't want to drive. She'd much rather have a personal driver, I think, than be driven. So,
yeah, we see that a lot more of kids not having the desire to get their driver's licenses and are just fine with mom and dad actually driving them around. Because what was interesting with that statistic is actually we saw the same trend across all socioeconomic and all geographical locations. So it's not that Uber and Lyft are now taking kids where they want to go, and it's not that, you know, rich kids are getting something but poor kids aren't. Everybody seems fine with not having that particular piece of independence. So.
Yeah, Nancy, I wonder, Nancy Parker's on. She's a campus minister at Vanderbilt Wesley. Do you have any students that you know of in your ministry that don't have their license?
Yeah, I immediately knew that they drove less. But also I work on a campus that they're not allowed to have their cars. And so I thought it was more because of Uber and Lyft and the ability to really get places without having to call a taxi or without having to ride public transportation. But it's interesting to me with these statistics because I think about the beginning of my ministry was in college was millennials. And then now we've gone through cuspers, and now I have almost entire Gen Z is what we're calling them.
That's what we've got right now.
And it's been interesting. The thing I think that that I resonate most with in this activity is this idea that home or going out, there's still people that love to party and go out. I just mean more along the lines of going out is less, I mean, going out as a whole, like they would, this sense of home, it seems to be very well developed for them. I don't know if that's really, I don't know. I can't really say anything definitively, but I do notice a trend of them not necessarily wanting to be out all the time.
Yeah, I see that in my son especially. He's much more of a homebody and prefers to be at home than he does really any other places. You know, it's like, you know, Shelly and I would like for him to be gone some, so we would have you just go out with your friends, you know. But he was like, no, I like being home. So, you know, which is great in a way that he feels comfortable being there and having his friends there. But you know, it's also concerning about what does that translate when he does go off to college, you know. Will he be able to connect into a community there? So
yeah. And I know when I was a teen, I'm an older millennial, and so when I was a teenager, I was out of the house every chance I could get, hanging out with my friends, pushing curfew, you know, really, really wanting to be with people, and somewhere other than home. So what's really interesting, and this is where the generational viewpoint is really, really important, because it lets us see those trends and start to look at what might be driving those trends. Because it's really easy for, you know, a baby boomer or a Gen Xer or even a millennial to look at young people who have different behaviors than we did at their age and go, oh my gosh, what's wrong with this generation? What's happening? And immediately make that judgment call. Rather than asking the question, okay, what might be different that is causing some of these changes? Because we see some differences between other generations as well. I always joke that we don't have 13-year-olds getting married and having babies like they did probably in the 1500s, and we don't think that's a bad thing. And so we want to acknowledge that over time we have those shifts in the way that these teenage years have been seen. But here's the bottom line of this shift, and it's a really, really interesting one, is that Gen Z overall is growing up slower than previous generations. We have in our mind a lot of times that they're actually growing up faster. That's language that gets used a lot. But I want to distinguish the difference between things that are markers of growing up and markers of adulthood, and simply having knowledge of more mature information. So, for example, we can look at something like sex and pregnancy, which we know is happening less with Gen Z. However, they probably knew about both sex and pregnancy at a younger age than previous generations did. So they're doing it less. But they probably knew more about it sooner. And in some ways, there could be a correlation there. If you understand things like drugs and sex and the dangers that are associated with them, you might be less likely to engage in those activities. So there actually could be a correlation there if we really want to push it. But the bottom line is simply having the understanding and the knowledge about something doesn't mean, one, that you're doing it, nor does it necessarily mean that you're growing up faster. And so that's a differentiation I like to make, especially for older generations, that simply knowing more does not mean automatically having a quicker maturing experience. Because when we see all of these things that are happening less, a lot of things that are markers of adulthood that are wrapped up in those questions, they're doing less of them at earlier ages. They're delaying. I mean, we already see delays in things like marriage for millennials. You already started to see that process, and then we see it in a much sharper turn with Gen Z. So all of this data is from a book, and it's one of the few books out there that actually, again, takes that generational viewpoint with Gen Z. And so, that's the book. Sorry, my screen Okay. But here we go. The entire developmental trajectory from childhood to adolescence to adulthood has slowed. They are more likely to act like children, not by being immature, but by postponing the usual activities of adults. Adolescence is now an extension of childhood rather than the beginning of adulthood. That to me is the biggest turning point when we ask the question, how do we minister to and with Gen Z? I think we, especially in youth ministry, we have to take seriously the idea of adolescence no longer being the preparation for adulthood, but actually the conclusion of childhood. Now, we've known for a while that we've had this new sort of life phase in our 20s of emerging adulthood. That's been a big conversation in young adult ministry. And so we've seen that. But I think previous to this research that Jean Twenge did, we saw more the idea of adolescence being extended when really it's been postponed in some way. And so a lot of the things that were happening for some previous generations in those teenage years as far as adolescence are happening in their early 20s. And so instead of teenage years, Brad, you talked about, wondering if your kids are ready to go to college. College now becomes the place that they often do the practicing of budgeting and figuring those things out. Whereas we may have done that as a teenager, pushing some limits, staying out, doing those kinds of things. And Nancy, I'd be interested to see if you're seeing some sort of more teenage behaviors that we thought of as teenage behaviors showing up in your Gen Z students that are arriving.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was teaching a workshop on Commons, which is our first year experience. They basically house them all on a specific area of campus. Mm-hmm. And I did 5 workshops back to back, which was a lot. And I just noticed what you're talking about, this sort of immaturity, I would be more interested, I guess this kind of turns into a question of activities of adults, because I'm noticing you mentioned budgeting, mm-hmm. But I'm also noticing, I don't know, somewhat of interpersonal dynamics, inability to really engage in deeper conversations. Would that be more of an activity of adult too? Like, I was noticing, I think that was the biggest thing I noticed was to stick with, focus, and stay with depth in a conversation.
Yeah.
Our workshop was very reflective. Mm-hmm. So in some ways it's like, maybe I should have taken it down a notch, but it's just reading Howard Thurman and Parker Palmer quotes was challenging for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that shift, I think if you think of it in the like Thanksgiving dinner, like that shift from the child's table to the adult table where you have to shift your conversations, I think is a good metaphor to think about that. And they're staying at the kids' table a little bit longer. And so they haven't necessarily practiced those adult conversations. They haven't engaged in that way. So that might be a good metaphor to think of. It's just interesting. I love that y'all have these very concrete people to think about too. And I'll share a story with you. Is I had a conversation with a teenager that I worked with at a previous church recently, just struggling with some different things. And I said something about, that really obnoxious comment that sometimes comes out of our mouths of like, that's just part of growing up, kid. Which, I try not to say things like that, but we were at that point where he was like, yeah, I just feel like I need to take on a little more responsibility, all of that. And so it was a little more appropriate than me just being an obnoxious adult. But he made the comment, he said, I made the comment. I said, I think you're going to be seen as a leader wherever you go. You're older in the youth group now, and I think you're going to be seen as a leader no matter where you are. And he said, yeah, I just wish I could still be a kid. Mm-hmm. I wish I weren't going to be seen that way. And this is a really strong kid, smart, capable, charismatic, outgoing, one of those kids that just is such a core of a youth group. And for him to even articulate, I'm not ready to grow up yet. I want to still be seen as a kid. I miss those days where, nobody worried about what example I was setting. Mm. And it was like him speaking this data to me, verbatim almost. And it was just really, really interesting to hear him articulate that and be aware of that. And so again, I think we've got a unique situation because we have a generation with more knowledge than any generation before it at its age. These kids have access to every piece of information in the world. And that is an unusual combination with a generation that is growing up a little bit slower. And that isn't hitting the markers of adulthood as early. One of the things in this book they talk about too is the word adulting is now one that we all use. Like, I don't really want to adult today. I don't feel like adulting today. Somebody posted earlier a meme that showed up on my Facebook feed that said something like, adulting is like looking both ways before you cross the street and then getting hit by an airplane. And it's those kinds of things that are part of all of our parlance now, but weren't 15 years ago. The word adulting was not something that people talked about. It wasn't this thing you learned to do. And so even separating that out, that there are these behaviors that are specific to adults, and these experiences that are specific to adults, again, just emphasizes this, because it's a lot coming out of younger millennials and then older Gen Z who are starting to hit adulthood and going, I'm not ready for this. So that I think when we think about the next phases of how we do youth ministry, I always thought of it as preparing for adulthood, and this is shifting a little bit. It's not that it's not preparing for adulthood, but it's not in the same way that it used to be. That there is something about youth ministry that's going to have to acknowledge itself maybe as more of an extension of children's ministry, in a way that we might not have thought of it in the past. So we can come back to keeping this in mind. This is the book that a lot of that comes from. If you want some of the details of what exactly those percentages are and difference between generations, iGen is the book by Jean Twenge. There's other books about Gen Z out there. I've read a lot of them, and most of them are really just research of what a teenager's like and not like. And that's fine. There's a Barna study out there right now, and we'll look at some of the data from it in a minute, but it's really a point in time what do teenagers think. This is the only thing I've seen out there that's actually how is this generation different from previous generations? And I think that's the most valuable information we can get. Yeah, Nancy?
Help me understand a little bit more about adulthood and what I think when you're talking about markers of adulthood,
Mm-hmm.
I think of the word responsibility, leadership. I mean, really, responsibility is the main thing that I think about. Help me understand a little bit more because I'm actually coming from as a point of which where I don't want to be is that sort of millennial young workforce person that's like, these kids just don't want responsibility and they ghost every day and they just don't want to be adults, and I don't want to be that person. So help me a little bit more about this responsibility, either if adulting is really responsibility, then help me understand how to think of it differently, or at least reframe it for me so that I'm not that crotchety person that's like, they ghost every day.
Let me get to the generational piece of it, and that might answer some of that, because it doesn't necessarily answer what do you do about that. I think that's a different webinar. But thinking about what there's a historical and societal and cultural reason that this generation's growing up slower.
Okay.
And so let's see if that answers the question, and then we can come back to that if it doesn't.
Great. Thank you.
So that's what we're going to get to here. So this is the landscape of generations in our culture right now. A lot of times when we hear the word intergenerational, we hear adults and kids, as though adults are all one thing and kids are all one thing. And in reality, adults are at least 4, if not 5 things, if we talk generationally. And so this is sort of the landscape. We may have as many as 6 generations in our cultures. Honestly, if we go ahead and cap Gen Z at 2015, we've got a 7th that is 3 years old. That is the very beginnings of that generation as well. And then we have a handful of our greatest generation who are still with us as well. And so when you look at this landscape and you ask the question, why does it feel harder than it used to? One of the reasons is that 100, 115, 20 years ago, the average lifespan was between 40 and 55 years old. And so we didn't have this many generations all trying to coexist in the same society. And so we celebrate longer lifespans, we celebrate modern medicine, but it's produced a situation that we didn't have before. It used to be a very wait your turn. If you wait your turn, you'll get your chance to do the thing that is the adult thing. So, you have kids and then you get to be in charge eventually. Now waiting your turn means waiting until you're at least in probably your 60s, if not your 70s, to be in charge. And so that really doesn't work. But that also explains some of why the church has gotten behind in a way that it might have been farther ahead in the past. So some of the same people are in charge of churches that were in charge of churches 30 years ago. And it used to be a quicker handoff of things, only because people died younger. So we aren't looking to go back to that, but we have to look at our landscape and say, we've got to approach things in a different way now. So that's one learning, is to understand that Gen Z is entering a world that has far more competition for leadership and understanding. And so they also see all of these people ahead of them and going, we're good. We'll hang out as kids a little bit longer because there's a bunch of y'all and you haven't quite got it figured out, because we're paying attention and we notice things aren't great. And so I think there's an element of that. But when we look at how we define generations, a lot of times people want to define generations based on technology or pop culture, and those aren't unrelated, but those aren't actually how we determine generations. So I want to do a real quick overview of simple, the basis of generational theory. So this is, if you're a nerd, get your nerd hat on, get ready for this. If you're not, you're free to tune out and come back when we get to some slightly more practical stuff. But I think this will help answer exactly what, Nancy, you're asking, and helps to put into perspective why we have conflict between generations and why we might see Gen Z so very, very differently. So when we look at our generational shifts over time, can you see my cursor if I put it up there? Oh, I can't see my cursor, so maybe you can't. So when we look at our generational shifts over time, generational shifts are actually based on historical cycles. And what we see throughout all of American history, and actually even going farther back, we see an alternation in history between major social moments. And one of those is a social crisis, and one of those is a spiritual awakening. And we go back and forth between these two historical moments throughout all of history. So if we look at the 20th century, which we have right here before us, we see right around the time the greatest generation is coming of age, in the 40s or so, we see a social crisis. We see the Depression. We see World War II. We see all of the multiple world wars that are leading into this. And World War II is sort of the culmination of that. And so we see a social crisis that happens. And you have a generation that, the greatest generation, that comes of age during that social crisis. That's actually how we determine the type of generation that we're looking at. The greatest generation is what we know as a civic generation, because if you come of age during a social crisis, you tend to think a little bit more about economics and politics and things like that. You tend to be more aware of them because you can't not be, because there's just a social crisis going on all around you. You also tend to think more of the greater good, and tend to be more communal in your approach to the world. And so the greatest generation came of age during that social crisis is a civic generation. The silent generation immediately following the greatest generation was largely born into that social crisis. And so you see that they were born between 25 and 45. So they were born into everything from the Depression to World War II. And so they were born in the midst of social crisis. Now, when you're born in the midst of social crisis, what do you think your parents are more likely to do? How might their parenting style differ?
More protective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot more protective. We're going to keep our kids at home a little bit more. We're going to be a little bit more concerned about who they're hanging out with and where they're going and all of the things that are happening to them. So the silent generation, that's where the word silent comes from. They were a group of children that was mostly seen and not heard. Their parents held them a little bit closer. This is also the first generation that's kind of growing up post-industrial revolution. You're starting to see kids who aren't working in factories, and that becomes part of our culture as well. So kids have a little bit more of an extension of childhood here as well. So kids born into social crisis tend to be a little more overprotected, tend to be held on to a little bit tighter. Now, as we come out of our social crisis, one of the beauties of social crisis is it forces us to reestablish some boundaries, to redevelop some institutions, to put some things into place that take care of people a little bit better. And so what usually comes after a social crisis is an era of a little bit more prosperity. Things are pretty stable. Things are pretty good. You can grow economically. You can grow also spiritually. Because when you're worried about where your next meal comes from, or if there's going to be a bomb dropped on your country, you're not necessarily thinking higher thoughts about God and faith and human rights and things like that. When everything, all of the basic needs are met, this whole Maslow's hierarchy kind of a thing, you then have the luxury of being able to think in a slightly more high level manner. And so that's why we get a spiritual awakening following a social crisis. So the spiritual awakening of the 20th century, we start to see things like civil rights, the civil rights movement. We see feminism. We see things like Woodstock. You see the anti-war movement really is more of a spiritual awakening than a social crisis. So all of that gets wrapped up in that sort of mid-20th century spiritual awakening. Now, the baby boomers came of age during that spiritual awakening, largely. And a generation that comes of age during a spiritual awakening actually has the privilege of being able to think about themselves as individuals. So you start to see a generation, we call them an idealist generation. They think a little bit more individually. They think a little bit more idealistically. They're a much more optimistic generation because for the most part in their lifetime, things have been pretty good. Things are getting better. Things appear to be moving in the right direction. And so baby boomers are an idealist generation, again, really optimistic, a little more idealistic, and very much more individualistic. Because again, that's something that you can only get to do if all of your basic needs are met, is to think individually. Now, a generation that comes of age and begins to have babies in the midst of a spiritual awakening is not thinking about their babies first sometimes, and is also, as part of feminism and all that we see in that sort of mid-20th century spiritual awakening, we see women who for the first time can choose whether or not to have children. We have things like birth control. We have no-fault divorce, where women can be divorced without and get they start to get different rights of being able to buy land, or we see the Voting Rights Act coming in early in the 20th century, but we start to really see women living into that later in the 20th century. And so along all of these women's rights movements and things like that, you see fewer babies happening. People are not having kids as often. And when they are, they're still focused on themselves in addition to their kids. So you end up with a whole generation that's a smaller generation, and a generation that isn't as overprotected, isn't being watched day and night, is sort of being left to their own devices. And that is Generation X. They're what we call a nomad generation. And they're a generation that generally figures it out on their own. And that all has to do with being born into a spiritual awakening. When older generations, their parents and grandparents, are a lot more focused on themselves because they can be. Now, all of that, if you can imagine, when we really, really think, in these high-minded ways, we think idealistically, we think optimistically. If we get too far into that, things start to kind of fall apart again, and we work our way back into another social crisis. You can kind of see this again through all of human history, that we go through these cycles of fixing things, having a really great time, and then they kind of fall apart again. And so we start to see that as we go into the 80s, the 90s, and then 2001 is sort of the initiation of our latest social crisis era that we talk about with 9/11. We then go into the 2008 recession. And then if you look at our current political and social climate, no matter what part of it you're a part of, everybody kind of can go, things are not quite as they should be. And there's a bit of a crisis happening. And so we find ourselves again now in the midst of this social crisis. And we have millennials who begin to come of age during this social crisis. They're coming of age there in the mid to late 2000s and then the 2010s. And so millennials begin the cycle again. So millennials actually are the same generational type as the greatest generation, a civic generation. Begin to think a little bit more collectively, tend to be a little more entrepreneurial, want to fix it, and have that independence. And they've been told by their baby boomer parents that they can be and do anything, because that's what optimism gives you, is you tell your kids they can be and do anything. And so millennials then graduate into the 2008 recession. My husband literally graduated college in 2008, and he can tell you he could not be and do anything he wanted to be in 2008. and so millennials kind of look at the world and go, that's not the way it looks. Let's fix it. And so you see millennials being a lot more entrepreneurial. You see millennials starting nonprofits right and left, becoming CEOs of little startups here and there. And thinking about sort of that collective good in a different way. So then you end up with another generation that is born in the midst of social crisis. And this is how we get back to Gen Z. So Gen Z, much like the silent generation, was born in the midst of social crisis. They were born into a world where their parents couldn't look at things and know for sure everything was going to be okay. I have a lot of friends actually right now going, I might want to have kids, but I'm not sure I want to have kids right now. I'm not sure this is a world I want to bring children into. And so those kids who are born into that social crisis tend to be a little more overprotected, tend to be kept home a little bit longer. I believe we know the term helicopter parents. And that's where a lot of that comes from, is being a generation that's born into social crisis. And so if you put it into that whole historical perspective, we see with the silent generation a slight extension of childhood to where it became more normative to graduate high school rather than finishing 8th grade and going and working on the farm with your parents. You start to see fewer kids going, again, worker to get kids out of factories and more back into schools and things like that. And with Gen Z, we see a second, I think, extension of childhood as a result of our current situation in social crisis. So that is like the fastest run through generational theory of the 20th century I can give you. What comes to mind? What questions come to mind? What thoughts come to mind with all of that data?
It's interesting to see the cyclical effect, because like you said, my dad was born in 1936, so he was born in the midst of that. My mom in 1940, multiple children families then. Mm-hmm. Dad worked on the farm, but he was pretty isolated. It was a very close-knit family. My mom, one of the younger of the 7 kids, very close-knit farming town community too. And then I remember, I've told this to these guys here, but turning on the television, giving Mary our oldest, a bottle on 9/11, and watching the Today Show, and Shelly and I looking at each other. It's like, what did we just bring this child into, Yeah. And so you think about her, like she's 17, born in 2001. Her entire existence, the United States has been in conflict somewhere in the world, right? Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, one of the names that has been thrown out, and is one of my favored ones for Gen Z is potentially Homelanders. Because of the sort of the way that they're, and this is all American centric, I should say. This is all U.S. centric, right. and largely Anglo-centric, which is a whole other element of this, that, prosperity in the 50s and 60s didn't feel so prosperous if you were not white. But if we sort of set some of that aside, at least for the sake of the presenting the theory, that but that's where we start to see those names come up of something like Homelanders for Gen Z.
I was wondering too, in this hyper-partisan time that we're in, is there a study of like the greatest generation is more this or more that, or the silent's more Republican or more Democrat, or it's like, is there generational data on that would suggest how that's divided, or is that less of a generational thing and more of an ideological inside of a generation?
You know, I don't have that data offhand, so I'm not
Yeah,
going to pretend I do. I have ideas.
yeah.
I have thoughts.
Yeah.
One of the things I will say that is different about this turn and this social crisis than it was when we look at the last social crisis of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the world wars, and particularly World War II, there were good guys and bad guys, and we knew who they were. And so it was black and white. There was a little bit more of a black and white approach to that crisis, I think. I think we are in a bit of a messier time now because there isn't a clear good guys, bad guys situation. I saw a post that someone had actually looked at all of the different conflicts that we are in the Middle East and traced who each of those people were in conflict with. And if you actually followed the whole path of this country is fighting with this country is fighting with this country, we were actually fighting ourselves in the end. And so I think that's one of the things where comparisons are helpful, and I'm making one here, obviously, but I think when you look at something like that of the political partisanship, it's a lot more complicated now. Because when you were fighting German Nazis, everybody was clear on who was on the other side. Mm. And I think that we're not as clear in our current global climate. Okay. So, you know, I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah.
That I would say it's a lot more complicated to even if we did that research, it would be a more complicated conversation.
I will say that I do think that it helps this generational theory about my question earlier surrounding how to understand why they don't like have a sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because in some ways, I've thought a lot about how the anxiety of parents and really the people around you is so transferable onto one another. And I've thought a lot about how this the anxieties, it's pretty. I don't have any research on this, and you may or may not, Melissa, but the anxiety and mental health issues are increasingly problematic on college campuses. And and in some ways, I'm wondering, some of that, I feel like it's sort of like this, like, sort of anxiety transferring onto everyone else, and it just becomes this, like more anxious.
Absolutely. Well, and when everything that we listed earlier was less, the one thing that's more is depression, anxiety, and suicide.
For sure.
So if you put that in there, knowing that is up with this generation, you know, when we talk about, you know, why are they not, however you finish this sentence, why are they not ready for adulthood? Why are they not ready to take on responsibility? If you put it in this perspective, you give a little bit more grace to their Gen X parents who are a little more overprotective and a little more helicoptery. You know, Brad, you articulated it well of holding your baby at 9/11 and going, oh, what are we doing? What's going to happen now? And so you have a little bit more compassion, because it's easy to point the finger to say, oh, their parents messed them up. Well, their parents responded to the culture they were in. And these kids are responding to the culture they're in. And here's the really the generational theory bright spot for me, and what's exciting about working with Gen Z for me is, while they've been a lot quieter as kids, they're a lot less rebellious, they're a lot less likely to push back, they're a lot less likely to disobey, they're a lot less likely to fight with their parents. But then you see moments like Parkland, and you see teenagers who have an uprising. Because they've been watching it. They're not idiots. They know what's going on, and they understand it pretty well. And they're not ready to be adults yet, but if they watch and see adults aren't being adults, they're ready to step in. and so when you see Parkland kids having an uprising because they're tired of seeing their friends get shot, that doesn't surprise me, because if you go back to the silent generation, if you look at their birth years, those are also our civil rights leaders, because eventually they also got tired of watching what wasn't right around them and began to stand up for it. MLK was a silent generation individual. And so don't count them out. Don't count them out from doing big things just because they're not ready to adult any earlier than, or as early as some of us are. They may have been sitting back a little bit and not jumping forward, but they've been paying attention and they know what's going on. And so they may take a little longer to get there, and they may do it in a different way. I'm not worried about them getting there. We just have to figure out how we take care of them until they do. So.
And I think going back to what you said before about more depression, anxiety, suicide, what Nancy's seen on campus, and what we've seen, we just had a young adult take his life from our church who's a freshman in college, helping them survive this time of intense pressure or transference or whatever it is that they're absorbing. They're absorbing the stress in the community and in society, and how to process that, right?
Yes.
And so how do we have people who are just trained to be listeners of them so that they can release that stress and not internalize that stress?
And that's exactly right. And mentorship and partnership with someone who's been there, done that is past that. I mean, with retiring baby boomers and older adults are the best thing that we can give, particularly silent generation folks can give our Gen Zers, because they understand some things. And one of the major characteristics of the silent generation is stability. They're one of our most stable generations. And that's what they did, is they figured out how to stabilize the country after that social upheaval. And so that's actually one of the greatest gifts we can give them. However, we do have to do that training and that preparation, because when they see 20-somethings who are struggling with very basic adult functions, they go, when I was 20, I was over, across the sea or across the world fighting. What's wrong with you? And if they are absorbing anxiety and they are absorbing stress and they are dealing with mental health issues, the last thing they need is a finger pointing at them saying, you should be something different. And so exactly what they need are those relationships, but we have to figure out how we prepare those people with information like this, because when I give this information to people, it lets them frame why back in my day, it was different. Yes, it was. And that's okay. And so how do we address what's going on now without imposing something that's from a totally different historical context and a totally different cultural context on them? How do we walk alongside where they are right now? And I think we can help speed up that adulting process with those mentors, but those mentors have to know how to do that. And so that training piece is essential. Put in here. So here's just a quick overview. If we want to look at Generation Z in a nutshell, we talked about them being an adaptive generation. That's theoretically. We still don't know for sure. This is all, generational theory is theory. This pattern may not continue. I think we're starting to see some of it continue, and we'll see what adaptations and what differences we see with Gen Z as opposed to previous transitions. We see them at home a lot more. They are children of our helicopter parents. They're less likely to engage in a lot of those dangerous behaviors that we saw with previous generations. This was a big one that is more of like a point in time thing, but is something to be aware of, is that we see them very focused on personal achievement. And some of that comes from that helicopter parenting of, if you don't do these things, you're not going to get in the right college, you're not going to be able to blah, 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 blah. But focused more on that getting to the next step rather than being prepared for the next step. And I think that's some of also what we see of the extension of adolescence. This is a big one, is that they're very indecisive, and some of it comes from not wanting to offend. And so they're very aware of the they're aware of the impact of social media. They're aware of the impact of words and how quickly a tweet can travel. And so sometimes they don't want to make a choice for fear of making the wrong one. And they don't want to make a choice for fear of doing harm to someone. And so that is something that we just start to see is their unwillingness to make that decision.
Yeah, I don't know if it was you. Somebody's used the FOMO, fear of missing out,
Uh-huh.
and FOMO, fear of messing up.
Yeah, yeah.
I see that athletically. I saw that with my son, who he was not willing to try a sport unless he thought he was going to be highly successful doing it first. And I had to really talk to him about that's the purpose of practice. And,
Right,
that's why you practice at it. That's why you
right.
go and commit to it. If you want to be good, there's work that you have to do, right? But it
Hmm.
was really like, I want to be successful before I ever step on the wrestling mat, and that's just not,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Well, and there's a whole culture built around one wrong step can ruin your life. They see this in the media, they see this on social media, and that's the mindset is one wrong step can ruin your life. So it gets perceived by older generations as not wanting to work for something.
yeah.
But it actually has to do with that. I don't want to make the wrong move and mess everything else up.
Does that show us that we've become less graceful in our community, in our society? There's a lot less grace necessarily if we're saying one mistake and you're done.
Could be. And I think the speed at which information travels contributes to that.
Yeah.
So
In
on
some
the
way,
go ahead.
oh, I'm just saying, in some way, this conversation is making me realize how much why they don't want to be adults. In some ways, answering the own
Yeah,
questions.
right.
We've given them the pressure of adulthood without any of the good stuff. I mean, like the sort of feelings that responsibility can bring when you are able to carry out an event or able to do something and it actually makes a positive impact and change.
Yeah.
They don't have that. They have all of the pressure of being on stage all the time with their phones and this and that. And so it's no doubt that they are like, they've had a taste of it and they're like, no thanks. But they haven't seen sort of the other side of the
Mhm.
same coin.
Well, and it's the era of zero tolerance policies, things like that. One strike and you're out. I think there's a lot of that with the way we do school and the way we do, policing and all. I mean, all of this, it's all wrapped up. It's not one thing. Now, I will say on the other side, this is sort of the next piece is on the other side of the indecisiveness and the desire not to make the wrong choice or to offend. We start to see a little empathy that this generation has that other generations don't have as much. Because if you're aware of how something can impact someone else, that's a sign of empathy. So recognizing the impact you can make on someone else, and caring what that is, we see more dramatically in this generation than others. And so I think that's something that we can tap into, and see as a strength of this generation, particularly is their ability to recognize how their words and their actions impact others in a way that other generations aren't as aware of. Jumped back on me. This is the big, if you ask me, like, what do we need to be teaching kids now, as a result of all of this is a big one, is critical thinking skills. In back in the day, we needed to teach them data and information. They don't need us to teach them that. They can go find that. They have access to every bit of information in the world at their fingertips, literally on their phones. And so if we spend time just giving them information they can go find somewhere else, we could actually be using our time more wisely. And I think this is the big one, is giving them those critical thinking skills to be able to, when they go look for this information, how do I evaluate it? What do I do with it? How do I figure out what's a trustworthy source and what's not? Both with individuals, people that they know, but also what they find online and things they hear in school and with their friends and all of those things. So how do we give them those critical thinking skills, both practically and theologically? One of my favorite activities I did with my confirmands was a thinking theologically session. And so gave them three questions to ask of anything. If you want to think about it theologically, what does this say about God? What does this say about us? What does this say about our relationship with God? And we practiced that with internet memes. Kids love memes. And so all of those inspirational memes about how God opens a window and closes a door and all of those kinds of things. So I put those in front of them, gave them those three questions, and we walked our way through a bunch of internet memes. And we're able to to look at different ways to interpret them, and what might be problematic, and what matches our theology, and what's different, and it's those kinds of activities that I feel like stick with them in a way that just simply teaching them facts and data that they can get somewhere else don't. And so again, if you want to ask that question, what do we do? I think that's a really big one. This is, again, just a little bit of point in time data from Barna. Gen Z, what is their ideal church? This I thought was just great, because if you ask any baby boomer, Gen Z want a band and smoke machines and everything to be really cool. If you've met teenagers, they're not quite that monolithic. We find that they do want something that's more communal rather than solitude. I wonder if that's because they spend a lot more time in solitude and find that community in church. That's just an I wonder. They prefer a sanctuary style to an auditorium. So they like they want church to look like church. They prefer a casual setting versus a formal setting. I don't think that would be a surprise. Probably most groups of teenagers probably would have at this same age. They are okay with variation, with things changing. Now, I think they would want some sort of ritual to connect, but the idea of a different worship style or a different worship experience, their preference is that varying. Now, here's where it gets into 50-50s. There are about 50-50 things to be quiet or loud. Again, if you asked most of our older generations what young people want, they want it to be really loud, not necessarily. They were about 50-50 preferring traditional or modern. They were about 50-50 between relaxed or exciting. They were about 50-50 between things feeling more like performance or things feeling like ritual. They were about 50-50 between classic or trendy. And, oh, yeah, okay. That was all of those. So I think this is just a good snapshot for people to be aware of, is that there's not one way of doing church that meets the needs of young people. That by and large, the things that we think are preferred by young people are actually about 50-50 when you do that standard split.
Darn it, Melissa. You were supposed to tell us that we were doing everything right.
I know, right?
You had a definite answer.
And I think this is so much about treating people but like people, that we know that people have preferences, and that young people are just like other people that have preferences. And they're not one monolithic group of individuals as well. So I know we're at time. So let me just real quickly. So some of y'all are in Nashville. Actually, everybody here on the call is in Nashville. Coming up in May, we'll be having a conference all about how we connect generations in the church. This is the only conference that we're aware of that actually talks about the whole church intergenerationally, and not just family ministry and not just youth ministry with an intergenerational focus, but the whole church and what an intergenerational church might look like. And so since most of y'all are local, this would be a great opportunity. You can go to intergenerateconference.com or find Intergenerate on Facebook. We don't have a lot of info up. We're getting all of our info together right now. And so we'll have a lot more info up in the next couple of weeks on the website. But if you want details, you can contact me. I'm on the task force for it and would love to tell you more about what we've got planned for this year. If you want to contact me, these are all of the many ways you can do that. My website is revmelissacooper.com, and then that's my Vibrant Faith email. You can find me on Facebook. Feel free to catch up with me there. But I would love to keep talking more about some of these things, and especially as we start to get more data and research about Gen Z as well.
And Melissa, give us a 30, 60-second elevator. What is Vibrant Faith?
Vibrant Faith is an ecumenical nonprofit that serves churches all over the country with coaching, consulting, resources, research, a lot of different ways. My main work with them is as a coach and consultant. And so if you're looking for resources as far as walking alongside you in your journey in ministry, that is something I can do through Vibrant Faith. We do 6-month coaching cohorts with church leaders who want to develop an intergenerational lens and look more at how to do intergenerational ministry in your context. We just started one this month in October. We'll be starting new ones. We start on 6-month cycles in October and in April, and so we'll have a few more coming up in April. I do that with individual churches or individuals, so feel free to contact me more about that opportunity.
Well, thank you for being here. Anybody have any other questions or thoughts? Kylie, our lone, one of our true millennials. I'm not sure about Nancy. Nancy might be a millennial. Is she? Yeah. Thoughts, Kylie?
In the words of Melissa, I'd be a cusper.
Yeah.
Sure.
That's what
On
I
the
was going to
edge.
say. Yeah, technically, I think I would be on the cusp.
Yeah.
The very end.
Mhm.
A baby millennial.
Yeah, and I'm on the cusp. I'm born in '66, so I'm on that boomer millennial or boomer generation.
Boomer Xer, yeah,
Yeah,
that's a
Xer.
tough cusp to be on.
Yeah, yeah. So, and we had our children later, so we were in our mid 30s when our kids were born, you know, and so yeah, it's teaching them how to drive at 50 was not the same as my dad teaching me how to drive at 40, you know.
Yeah.
45. So, but this has been great. Very insightful. And I think it's one of those things is like, we can make assumptions, like you said, we can make assumptions about all the different things that we see. I read an article today from Fuller Youth Institute that talked about that the way that we utilize words like addiction, like telling kids that they're addicted to technology, is really very unhelpful in terms of defining what addiction really is. And so to rethink the way that we utilize words and do a lot of superficial statements and judgments about groups of people without really understanding what drives them.
Yes.
And that and just like we see in that generational map that you showed, that there are cyclical similarities based upon those social and spiritual constructs that happen that we need to be aware of. So,
and being able to frame my relationship with this is different than a Gen Zer's relationship with this. And not to judge their relationship with it based on how I utilize it. So my running around the neighborhood with friends on bikes is this for them in a lot of ways. So they aren't going out, but they're actually doing this. So
for those listening to the podcast, she was holding up her phone. So,
oh yeah.
And so
yeah.
and
So
and it's interesting
being
to
able
see
to see
that,
the relativity.
right? And in terms of saying that you know, they all have a certain preference of phone, you know, like they're split between iPhones and Googles or whatever is available, right?
Yeah.
And we just want to thank Melissa for her time, and those of you that joined us. Be looking out for our next podcast, our next webinar recording will be in December, and Mark Ostreicher will be talking about ministry with LGBTQ students.